You're tuned in to Women in America, the podcast that dives deep into the issues shaping gender equality in the U.S. and beyond. Hosted by Pari and Eve, public health professionals by day, content creators by passion, we bring you expert insights, compelling stories, and actionable strategies to push the fight for equality forward. This season, Rights at the Crossroads unpacks the intersections of reproductive rights and gender justice in today's America.
On this episode of Women in America, we chat with Kris Goldsmith about all of the ways in which this administration is failing veterans across America. Let's dive in. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. We are joined by my friend Kris Goldsmith, who is an absolute champion. And Kris, say hi to the people. Introduce yourself. Tell them what you're about.
Hey, thanks so much for having me on. My name is Kris Goldsmith. I'm a former United States Army Sergeant. I am now the founder and CEO of Task Force Butler Institute and Veterans Fighting Fascism. And I've got about a 15-year history in veteran advocacy. Used to work for a major congressionally chartered veteran service organization, where I worked on things like GI Bill, health policy, DoD personnel policy, all the way to things like investigating hostile foreign actors targeting troops, veterans, and our families online. Now I focus primarily on domestic extremism. I train veterans to track extremists so that we can hold them accountable in the court of law. But I'm also involved in Unites for Vets. It's a Unite for Vets coalition. It's an organization of organizations and individual veteran advocates who are speaking out against proposed cuts in both in VA staff and in VA benefits for veterans that impacts millions of veterans around the country.
So just a couple of things. The irony of saying that you're now working on domestic extremism, as someone who is naive about what that it actually entails, are you just like every second person is now a domestic extremist in this new reality that we live in?
Yeah, so what you're talking about is the Overton window. So I also went to Columbia University. I have a degree in political science. So my politics and policy thing isn't just a hobby, though it did start that way. The Overton window has shifted a lot over the last 10 years. And things that are now normal or even federal policy were unthinkable 10 years ago. I mean, Donald Trump has been talking about using ICE and the military in all sorts of terrible ways for a decade now, and most people thought this would never be possible. But here we are, because the Overton window, the window of what is acceptable policy that could be enacted, has shifted to the right. And we now have a political party. The Republican Party has been captured by Trump and MAGA, and things that were considered inhumane and un-American a decade ago are now supported by the majority of Republican politicians in the federal government.
Yeah, hearing you talk about the Overton window, which for folks listening, to put very simply, is essentially a concept that is used to describe the moral and political perception of a population as a whole. And as Kris mentioned, we've seen it shift significantly to the right, so much so that even now a lot of establishment Democrats no longer think of the Democrats as a left-leaning party, right? They're considered moderates because that's how much we've switched. But Kris, when you were speaking about the Overton window, the example that kept slamming around in my head was Pete Hegseth releasing those war plans on the Signal chat, right?
Yeah.
And I bring that up because, if we were to just take a pause, take a beat for a moment and think about how different our media is now than it used to be, let's say even 5 years ago, 10 years ago. If we were dealing with a situation like that 10 years ago, that would have been news for the next 8 years. There would have been nothing else that people were talking about. And folks like yourself, not to speak for you, but I'm guessing that folks in defense, in military, in national intelligence would have had such a strong visceral reaction to that. And now it's almost like that is being softened because of this huge politicization of things where it's well, when someone does something wrong, there's no longer an objective wrong or right. The first question people ask is, well, are they a Democrat or Republican? And that's going to help me determine how I react to this scenario, right?
Yeah. I mean, what Pete Hegseth did in sharing the time and the mode of attack on a foreign enemy before it happened and doing it on an unsecure platform, Signal, on an unsecured device, his personal device, rather than a classified, protected, property of the U.S. government cell phone. He violated a bunch of rules and regulations that if he were still in the military, he is not anymore, he's a civilian as the Secretary of Defense. If he were still in the military and he had done that same action, he would have been court-martialed. And especially after it got such press, including the editor of the Atlantic magazine, in communications like that, he would very likely, if not being kicked out of the military, would have been stripped of his rank. He could have served time. What he did, according to the military, was effectively a crime. But the Trump White House has sought to normalize criminal behavior by their appointees. And they're trying to normalize the abnormal, the absurd, when it comes to what happens with the military. We saw that with the Trump birthday parade. We've seen that with the deployment, not just of the National Guard, but of active duty Marines in Los Angeles. None of this is normal. And the Trump administration is doing everything that they can to try to, again, shift the Overton window so that they can push things even further towards the extreme and the absurd.
As a veteran, how does that make you feel? And I think that's like a very broad question, but I'm sitting here just like a general, normal person, woman in America, a public health expert looking at this and frankly just being like, what the fuck, right? But I have arguably much less of an emotional investment in like this process and the duty and that sense of things. But I'm thinking about it from your perspective and like, how are you staying sane, I guess, is what I'm asking. When like all of this stuff that you fought for, you put yourself on the line for, and frankly are continuing to put yourself on the line for, just in a different kind of way, is no longer honored, no longer has the gravitas that it is due. Tell me about your emotional state, I guess, is what I'm asking.
So I'll try to keep this very short. I got out of the military in a bad kind of way. I deployed to Iraq in 2005, and pretty much as soon as I got into Baghdad, like my worldview collapsed. I was someone who strongly supported the war, the global war on terror, the invasion of Iraq. I joined the military at the age of 18, 2 years after September 11th. I knew I was joining in a time of war. I wanted to deploy. But just before I deployed, orders came down that said, do not look for weapons of mass destruction, which was the reason we invaded. So I was like, okay, if the reason that we invaded was not true, why am I still going? And my worldview collapsed. I used to be conservative. I used to be a Republican back then. I am at this point, over 2 decades later, used to having my country break my heart and to fail to lead up to the ideals that I believed that it did. But in truth, our country has never been that great at living up to its ideals. We have the original sin of slavery. This wasn't the first war that was started under false pretenses, or that the people of the United States did not support, or politicians were not brave enough to be honest with the American people about what it would take to actually win and conclude a war. So 20 years after being in Iraq, I am no longer surprised by any of this. After I got out of the Army, the rise of the Tea Party, and we saw the tolerance of overt racism among the Republican Party because, well, if they just keep allowing the Tea Party to come in, they'll keep winning. They'll keep winning elections, so they'll tolerate the racism. And then the racism, became overt with first election of Donald Trump. And during his first administration, I was in D.C. I was in the Trump White House more than I was in the Obama and the Biden White House, working as a veteran advocate because I had a job to do. I wasn't happy to be there, but it was my job. So I have gotten to know people who have worked for Trump, who aspire to work for Trump, and I know people from the policy world that Pete Hegseth came out of. And he has always been, for lack of a better phrase, a piece of shit. Like, that's who he is at his core. The stories about him doing things like getting drunk and trying to get on stage at an adult club and like grabbing women. I was not with him, but I was in that community when these things were happening. And I am not surprised that he went on to Fox News and that he went on to being appointed to this post by Trump, because Trump loves the degradation of women. Trump loves this, what Mike Pompeo called swagger, this belligerence. And what I think I am most sad about, what I haven't come to terms with, is we have a generation of young men who have looked at this from a very young age. 18-year-olds who are joining the military today were 8 years old when Donald Trump first started running for president. So this has all been normalized for them. We have a nation full of young people who are going to serve in the military, who want to serve in Pete Hegseth's military, who want to serve in Donald Trump's military. And that breaks my heart.
Yeah, I'm so sorry. It is difficult even for me to hear. I can't imagine what that's like to experience. So what you said about how you've become used to America breaking your heart, I really hope we get to a point where our children are no longer normalized to that, you know? And I think that's what is keeping us in the fight. This comment you had about this new generation that is almost excited and like fully endorsing this new approach, I'm curious if you could tell me more about that, because, you know, one of the things that has happened post the 2024 election is that all of this analysis has come out from the Democratic side. And one of the big populations that they have decided that we have left behind is young men.
Mm-hmm.
So I know that to be true. I see it online. I'm unfortunately on the receiving end of a lot of that vitriol in my comments on a daily basis. But then at the same time, I also see the news, like you had mentioned, Trump's birthday parade. And there's this seems like pretty credible rumor going around that the reason why the footage is showing that all the soldiers are out of step is because it's like a silent protest. So tell me about how you maybe reconcile those two things happening, or like, do you see that this all existing within the same system, and like the same system sort of perpetuates two different ways of thought? Or what do you think is the direction in which we are headed, given that the military is very much in the news and everyone's focus and everyone's eyes right now?
Yeah, so I have seen a lot of veterans suggesting that the sloppy marching was a form of protest, but I think it was an accident. What most people don't realize if they've never been in the military is that what keeps us in step is music or cadence. So everyone's seen a movie at least where they're going left, 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 right, right. There's a tune, and when there is music that is designed for marching, there's a beat. There's a boom, 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 right? That was not present because Donald Trump was playing anti-war, anti-military songs like Fortunate Son while they were trying to march, and it's impossible to march without the sound, basically the metronome, to make sure that your left foot is falling at the right time. Mm-hmm. So with that said, I think that lack of planning and the total failure of Donald Trump to get a crowd where it belonged in front of the cameras to look good so that he could show that he is a strong man just goes to show how empty planning was behind what was supposed to be a fantastic spectacle that made him look strong. But, you know, as much as I am concerned about the generation of young men who are joining the military who are inspired by Trump's version of toxic masculinity, thinking that that's what they want to embody, I want to remind people that the United States military is the most diverse organization on the planet. And the U.S. veterans community is the most diverse community on the planet, not just in terms of racial, religious, ethnic, gender, but what people don't think of a lot in terms of issues of diversity, like economic strata and education. I mean, I served with people who got their GED, but most astronauts are also coming out of the military. So you have people who have literally the lowest education in the country. It's required to at least have a GED at most times in the military. Sometimes they make exceptions. And then you have astronauts, astrophysicists. So the military is an incredibly diverse system, and it relies on people from every state, every city, most towns around the country. And because of that diversity, there is always going to be some resistance, I guess, against this kind of like fascist impulse of these angry, usually white, but not exclusively white, young men who are joining to serve specifically under Trump.
Well, I love that. That's actually a really lovely glimmer of hope. You know, I appreciate that perspective because I really don't think that people understand that. In fact, I knew it in principle, but to hear you lay it out the way that you did was so helpful, because it's truly saying that there are people coming in from all walks of life into this system, into this organization, because at least before MAGA, you know, the military was pretty united, and at least in terms of how they viewed America and like our role. I don't know if I can speak to that anymore, but I do think that there's very valuable insight in what you just said, because, you know, like folks like myself, Our whole thing is that we're trying to bring a public health perspective to every piece of news. And so one of the things that we've been talking about with veterans recently is how the big bill that Republicans are considering in the Senate right now is going to be affecting veterans.
Yeah.
And I think people don't understand, first of all, that it is going to do that because, one, they don't recognize that veterans' benefits are tied to like things like Medicaid or SNAP and food assistance. But then they also don't necessarily see the VA as like this separate thing within like our healthcare system, when it's in fact not. And when I say it's not, it's because it's funded via the same mechanisms that everything else is, right? So while certain proportions of the military population will be okay, even if this bill passes, because, as you said, they are on the higher educated side or the higher economic side of the spectrum, there's still a significant proportion of veterans that are drastically going to have their lives changed if this big bill passes, right?
Well, what's, I think, most relevant to you as a health professional, as a healthcare policy expert, is the fact that the VA is the single largest trainer of medical professionals in the United States. The vast majority of doctors, whatever field they end up pursuing, the vast majority of doctors spend some of their time training in a VA training facility, treating veterans. So right now, the big bill, the budget bill that Trump is championing, it would cut healthcare services at the VA and it would push more money into pushing veterans out of the VA and into private healthcare systems. Now, the way that this is branded by Republicans and the Trump people is, oh, this is VA choice. This is veterans getting the choice. Veterans fought for our country and they deserve the right to choose where they get their healthcare. Okay, that sounds like a good argument on its face, but when you're facing a choice of there are now fewer doctors at the VA, so you can't get care there, or you have to go to a general physician or a specialist who is in the civilian sector, who is not specifically trained in veterans' needs and the common illnesses and injuries that we have from military service, we're not making a choice. We're being forced into a worse healthcare system. The VA has higher patient satisfaction ratings, better healthcare outcomes, and there's nothing more important in a healthcare system than healthcare outcomes. Right. So by giving us this false choice of reducing VA staff, of getting rid of VA doctors, we're not just pushing veterans into the private healthcare system. We're also taking the biggest tool for training medical professionals in the United States, and we're making it quantifiably and qualitatively smaller and worse. So that is going to affect not just veterans, but everybody.
Yeah. It's almost like providing tailored services leads to good outcomes for a reason, right?
Mm.
And I think about this from like the perspective of even reproductive autonomy, because I don't know if a lot of people know this, but during the Biden administration, the VA was actually one of the government institutions that was upholding the right to reproductive autonomy. And they were obviously doing it specifically for women vets. And that changed in the last 3 months, not because of their choice, like you said, but because of a directive that came from above, right? And I think that it is, pardon my language, exceptionally fucked up that people who are going out there in service of our country then come home and cannot even control their own choices that they're making over their own bodies, let alone, like you were saying, the choices about where they're accessing healthcare, right? And I think one thing that you didn't mention was not only are you losing the choice to have the tailored, specific care for yourself, perhaps even in your own community, but now you are also being charged more for care that wasn't designed for you. And at least as of 2023, and I'm pretty sure the numbers have changed since then, but that was the last census that was done specifically on this. There's about 2 million veterans that are on Medicaid nationally. And then there's 6 million veterans' family members that are on Medicaid, right? And that doesn't even include then the 1.5 million that I believe are on food assistance and things like that. So what I'm saying is along every spectrum of healthcare, veterans are going to be affected. And it irks me so much that the way that this administration talks about it is as though it's this big, beautiful thing. I mean, like they literally call the bill the big, beautiful bill. I call it the MAGA murder bill because truly it is going to result in a degradation of health services, of care, even just in terms of the mental health services that are required for veterans or even active duty people. They are cutting all of that. And I don't think people are understanding this. And one of the things that I get frustrated by often is when I'm trying to engage with people in actual discourse, being like, hey, you're on the other side of the spectrum, and one of your biggest things is that you are pro-military. Like, you always support increasing the military budget. You believe that the United States needs to have the largest military in the world in order to maintain its global supremacy. So why are you then taking away the services from the people that you support? Like, not to say that I would understand it if you're taking away services from other folks, but like, there are reasons that I can see from your perspective that you're like, these people don't deserve, in quotation marks, this care. But to take it away from veterans, I feel like is so antithetical to their entire belief system that it really just doesn't track for me. Do you have a sense of how that cognitive dissonance is explained?
Yeah, the mind of the Trump voting veteran is the same as the Trump voting civilian. They have a desire to cause harm to other people. There just is no denying that. Like, one of the primary motivating factors of MAGA is taking things away from other people. And what too few veterans, MAGA veterans, realize is that the attacks that the Trump administration have waged against the transgender community, which is tiny, which is a minuscule piece of our population, by no longer recognizing gender dysphoria as something that the VA can and should treat. In fact, they have completely stopped. They have banned any language that even accepts that this is a legitimate medical condition. They are setting the stage to take away benefits from MAGA veterans too. What they are doing is they're saying that, oh, well, this is not a service-related condition. And that is something that a lot of these MAGA vets will agree with. They'll be like, okay, gender dysphoria was not caused by military service, so taxpayers shouldn't have to pay for it. That's their belief system. Now, if you use the same logic, you can expand that out to all sorts of things. Like, I have post-traumatic stress disorder. I deployed to Iraq in 2005, went through some really terrible experiences that were military related, but not deployment related. And that continued to affect my quality of life for years after. There was a 5-year dark period where I was self-medicating with alcohol and just in really terrible shape. Now, someone from VA could look at my medical records and determine, oh, you have a fatty liver, and that's related to your drinking. Well, you drank before you joined the military, so this is not a service-related condition. So should you go on to, say I were to continue drinking, get cirrhosis, get liver cancer, need a liver transplant, by the way, first successful liver transplant in history, done at the VA. It leads on medicine, right? So that logic can be used for all
anything.
sorts of conditions that veterans have. That is the direction that this administration and, the Heritage Foundation and Project 2025 and the conservative movement wants to go. And once they've established that they can do this to one small population, this is how fascism always works. They target the LGBTQ community first, and then they go out from there, which is why, as we're recording this, there's breaking news from The Guardian, which is talking about how the political appointees at VA, so Trump's henchmen, including Secretary Collins, Doug Collins, who has no medical background, his only business experience is running his family's scrapbooking store in Georgia. And that's what Trump thinks that makes him qualified for the largest healthcare system in America. They have ordered hospitals around the country to change their bylaws and the specific provision which prevents discrimination based on people's inalienable characteristics. So they are now allowing explicitly discrimination, not just in employment at the VA, but in the allocation of benefits, which means treatment, it means care, it means disability payments. A VA employee, if they are ideologically opposed to providing services to someone from a different political party, that is now allowed. They specifically took out protections for discrimination about marital status, national origin, and a few other things, which is profoundly un-American, and it is profoundly dangerous.
So you're saying that if someone shows up to the VA and their doctor is, let's say, a MAGA person. And based on what the patient says or, the way they present, the doctor assumes that they are of a different political leaning. You're saying that that doctor could literally refuse them service?
Under the guidance that's been given from the VA central office, VACO, to every VA hospital around the country, they are instructing them to change their bylaws to make that so. Some hospitals have already done it. I've got colleagues of mine who are trying to track down which of these hospitals have already implemented it. And the VA is, as we're recording this, responding to journalists. So the damage that can come of this is yet to be measured because this is a brand new policy. But the removal of things like the protection for people according to their political affiliation or their marital status, that was deliberate. These were things that were named in the protected categories under the VA's bylaws previously, and they are instructing them specifically to remove those words.
Okay, so I used to work at the CDC, and this is exactly what happened to the CDC during the first Trump administration, and now even more so during his second, where we received instructions down the pike that there were 44 words that we were no longer allowed to say. That was the very first warning sign, right? The red flag that came down. Mm-hmm. And true to what you were saying earlier, transgender was one of those words. Gender was one of those words. Sex was one of those words. Assault was one of those words. And I worked for the Division of Violence Prevention. So we were talking about rape prevention, and we weren't allowed to use the words assault or perpetrator or talk about folks that experience violence at higher rates, which are marginalized populations such as transgender folks or women. And that translated from step 1 into then step 10, which was like a just complete slashing of programs that were related to sexual violence prevention and things like that, right? So to me, this is like, from my public health lens, this is a huge, huge problem. And I know it's just breaking, and I'm curious to read more about what you write about it in your Substack later this week, which I'll share for folks listening in the show notes. But if this comes to pass, this could even set a precedent for every other federal agency, right? Because as you said, like the VA leads on healthcare infrastructure, on health innovation. Unfortunately, this might mean that they will also lead on health suppression.
Yeah. And to be crystal clear, I want to make sure that people understand the VA is bragging about removing care for transgender veterans. Like, the VA secretary himself has been producing multiple social media videos where he is smiling into the camera, talking about removing services for transgender veterans. The cruelty is the point, as Adam Serwer so eloquently put it in his headline of a piece a few years ago. The cruelty is the point. Their objective is to cause harm to vulnerable communities. The obsession with things like DEI and the idea of consolidating data from all across all of these different federal departments and agencies and putting them together makes it possible and far easier to engage in discrimination at scale. Elon Musk may not be friends with Trump right now, but Elon Musk's people are still throughout the entire federal government. The doggy committee still exists, the Department of Government Efficiency, which isn't a department, it's not efficient. That still exists, and the mission is still to combine federal data from across all of these departments. That would make it so that a VA employee or any employee of the federal government would have things like their voting history, their voter registrations, their medical history, combined with their employment records. It would all become searchable by basically this big government, big brother. This does not exist right now, by the way, but they are building it. So it would be possible, if they continue to move forward with integrating all these systems, to stop serving Black people or stop serving people who vote Democrat, stop serving people with certain diagnoses. And that is counter to everything about big government that Republicans have been talking about as long as the modern Republican Party has existed. But that is what we are moving forward to. I haven't told you this, but I am a plaintiff on a lawsuit against the federal government to stop them from integrating things at Treasury and Department of Education and the Office of Personnel Management, which is basically HR for the entire federal government, including the military. And though we had initial successes on our lawsuit, the appeals courts have since put a stay on orders for them to stop. So as of right now, all of these federal agencies are having their data combined, and this data can be weaponized in every way that anyone listening to this could imagine.
I didn't think we were going to touch on that, but I'm actually really glad you brought it up, because I want to be crystal clear with our audience and make the two connections between what you just said. One is that Doge has never actually been about efficiency or saving money, right? The entire point is this data mining to institutionalize white supremacy in our country. And I think that people are not putting that together because of the fact that they've done some tremendous amount of propaganda around Doge. But the big bill, which you and I were talking about earlier, increases the US's deficit to $4 trillion, which is the highest it has ever been. And I want people to ask themselves, if our deficit is now being legalized via a bill, the passing of a law, to the highest it has ever been, what is the point of anything Doge is doing, right? Because the entire thing was, hey, Doge is here to save us money. Well, if they're saving us money, then why are we increasing our deficit to $4 trillion? And the answer is exactly what Kris just laid out, is that it's not about the money. It's not about efficiency. It is entirely about making sure that there's data on every person in this country so that governments and police and whoever else, the vested interests that exist, perhaps corporations, can use that data and mine it however they want to institutionalize white supremacy. And it's challenging to say that because people don't see this big picture. But, I'm looking at the news recently and I'm like, oh, ICE agents, in quotation marks, because they don't wear uniforms, they're not identifying themselves, they're not required to have warrants, are picking up anyone that they believe meets their preconceived notions of what an immigrant is, right? So anyone that looks semi-brown, anyone that has perhaps like a different outfit style, whatever it is. We've seen cases in the last few weeks of them picking up American citizens, of them picking up legal visitors, tourists to the country. And I think that what we are doing is now, with each story that comes out, the media, the government, these institutions, the VA, unfortunately, are essentially getting us closer and closer to this normalization of the fact that if you are not white, you have to expect this. And this is going to be part of your daily life. This is going to be how you live in this country from now on, because we are a Christian, white, nationalist country. Even though they will never say that out loud, that is what they're doing via every one of the policies that they're implementing, right? And the reason I bring that up is because for those watching the video version of this, Kris is wearing a shirt that says Veterans Fighting Fascism. And I think that I want to be able to show people that there are, in addition to public health folks like me, there's folks like you that are taking a definitive stand against this. Even though you are, like, for all intents and purposes, really inside the system, right? You're way more inside the system than I am because you've been part of these organizations. So could you tell our audience some of the things that you and your organizations are doing to fight back against what is happening right now?
Yeah, so the Unite for Veterans Coalition is something that is brand new. We really just kind of started making waves a couple weeks ago when we held a rally on the Mall with about 7,000 people, which, as I understand it, is a crowd that is similar to what the President of the United States was able to rally when he had $45 million in many months of planning to do it. We came down to Washington, D.C., and veterans flew from all 50 states. I was meeting people from everywhere in the country to stand up against the firing of VA employees, to stand up against the firing of veterans and other civil service workers from across the whole of the federal government. Because, again, as you said, this is not about efficiency and it's not about saving money, because everything costs more in the private sector. The reason that the government provides these services because the private sector won't do it. Because there's no incentive. If they can't make enough money, they're not going to do it. That's why government exists. So what we are doing with Unite for Vets is building a coalition that is multi-generational, that is diverse in every way that you can imagine among an already very diverse population. And we are fighting the good fight everywhere that we can. Our objective, and the objective of all of the work that I do, is to go on offense for democracy, because we have been talking about defending democracy for 10 years. And it doesn't matter if you're playing a game of chess or basketball or you're fighting a war. If the only thing that you're planning to do is play defense, you lose. My personal objective and the objective of my two nonprofits, Task Force Butler Institute and Veterans Fighting Fascism, are specifically to impose costs. Now, when I created an organization called Veterans Fighting Fascism a few years ago, I was hunting Nazis, literal neo-Nazis. And I didn't imagine our mission expanding to fighting fascism from the White House and from the federal government. Now, I have to stay nonpartisan. I am not endorsing any sort of campaign or anything like that. But fighting fascism is nonpartisan. I am a veteran of the United States Army, which is the largest and most successful anti-fascist organization in history. D-Day was the anniversary where we launched Unite for Vets on June 6th this year, the 81st anniversary of the storming of the beaches of Normandy. And what I want to give people is hope. I work in the fields of extremism and politics, and a lot of this is obviously upsetting, often depressing. But when you change your mindset from feeling like you're on defense to saying, no, actually, I'm going to impose every legal, social, and economic costs, underlining legal. I'm going to impose these costs on the opposition to make it harder for them to take things away from other people. I think that I have myself have found a lot of energy and hope behind that. And especially for folks who look like me, if you're listening, you don't see this, but I am a bald, bearded, tattooed combat vet. I have an immense amount of privilege that allows me to do things that other people simply cannot in this country. And I think if you are a veteran and you've got the privileges that I do, there's a moral urgency behind weaponizing your privilege against those who are trying to weaponize their privilege against those who have none or have less.
That was beautifully said, Kris. I have to tell you, I don't often feel patriotic, but what you said just made me feel a little bit. So gratitude to you for that. Thank you so much for this conversation. You know, we said in the beginning that we could talk for hours, and I actually feel like we could. So we might have to schedule a follow-up because so many things you said, I'm like, I want to connect it to this and this and this. But for now, tell the people where they can find you and continue to listen to your wonderful, thoughtful perspective.
Thank you. So my handle is just about everywhere the same. It's Kris Goldsmith 85. That's Kris Goldsmith 85. If you want to find me on Substack, that's where I do my deep dives on offense.substack.com. TikTok is my primary platform right now, though I just had a baby 3 weeks ago today. So my TikToking has quieted down quite a bit. But anywhere that you follow me, whether it's Substack or TikTok, you will be getting an anti-fascist veteran's perspective. And I am not here to do the Aaron Parnas breaking news, just scare you shit. I give people hope and actionable things that they can actually do to stop fascism, not just be aware and scared all of the time, because I don't think that's very helpful.
Action is where it's at.
Thanks for tuning in to this episode of Women in America. In all the ways that Kris and I outlined, our military and our veterans are under attack from within. It's important that every one of us step up and fight back to ensure the protection of those who fought for us. If you enjoyed this episode, share with your network and don't forget to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. For additional resources, follow us on social media at Gemma_talks. See you next week.